The late James C. Scott was Sterling Professor of Political Science and Anthropology at Yale. His books include Seeing Like a State, Weapons of the Weak, Against the Grain, and the book we're discussing today, The Art of Not Being Governed. His New York Times obituary in 2024 called him one of the world's most widely read social scientists, a scholar whose work on why top-down government schemes of betterment often fail and how marginalized groups quietly undermined authority led him to embrace anarchism as a political philosophy. I'm Nancy Hess, publisher of MuniSquare and an organization development consultant to local governments. Joining me today are three colleagues: Dr. Mike Rowe, professor in the Public Sector Management School at the University of Liverpool and a longtime reader of Scott's work; Dr. Thomas Breyer, Pegasus professor at the University of Central Florida, soon to be founding director of the Center for Civic Lands and Democratic Stewardship at Old Dominion University; and Dr. Mandy Cantlin, manager at East Bradford Township in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and a lecturer at Westchester University. The title of this book wants to trip us up before we even crack the binding. The Art of Not Being Governed sounds so subversive. But if you look at Scott's life and body of work, you're led into a world that feels at times upside down from what we know of as government. Scott was a political scientist, part historian, part ethnographer of agrarian studies, and yes, part anarchist. Scott's book focuses on Zamia, the mountainous upland stretch of mainland Southeast Asia, roughly the size of Europe, where for 2,000 years people have lived deliberately outside the reach of surrounding states. His skeptical gaze asks, who chooses to be governed by a particular city-state? And more interestingly, why would someone choose to evade city-states? Are these behaviors a mark of people who lack civility? Or are we touching on something central to our humanity, our capacity to survive, adapt, and thrive in ways that states make difficult? I come to this conversation from a recent trip to Molokai, an island in Hawaii, with no stoplights, no tourism industry to speak of, and a long history of rejecting the kind of development that transformed its neighbors of Oahu and Maui. On Molokai, the locals have chosen a hybrid subsistence economy over big industry. In many ways, Molokai offers a contemporary view of the art of not being governed. Scott would recognize the moves: flight over rebellion, plural identities, mixed subsistence portfolios, a preference for autonomy and mobility over incorporation. As Scott puts it, flight, not rebellion, has been the basis of freedom. Egalitarian societies are more likely to be formed by runaways than by revolutionaries. So today we start with a few words about Molokai. Then Mike walks us through some classic Scott. And from there we trade insights and argue with Scott, where he invites it, about what his work can teach us in the world of local government today. I want to open up with a brief example because it, for me, was so relevant. I happened to visit the island of Molokai in the Hawaiian Islands for several weeks with some hosts that were very knowledgeable about the place. And I learned from this visit that Molokai sits in the middle as an island with no tourism. It has no stoplights. We were really in a rather remote area. There was a small condominium development, but alongside a development that had long been abandoned. It was a place with which people, they call it sometimes an island of failure because development just has not flourished there. And the reasons are very specific. There has been a history of domination by big industry there that the local people felt was not to their benefit. Also, there is some strong activism, which really supports this idea that developers that come from the outside that want to buy up the property and develop tourism are eventually going to find their way into the commissions and boards and take actions that will more permanently change the contour of the island life. So the people, it's not that they don't want economic prosperity. They want a version that they're very much a part of. That was my takeaway from my conversations. And I did look at some of the background study groups that came to the island to help them figure out what they wanted to do if they weren't going to allow for this development. It taught me also, and this goes to James C. Scott, that we do have the ability to stand up and say no. We hear this all the time in the United States that, oh, well, we have these zoning laws and there's really nothing you can do. It's the way it is. We have to let them develop. If people do have that ability, they will stay. But if they can't and they do not wish for the impact of that governance that's being put upon them, and this is going back thousands of years, but we can relate it to contemporary days, we simply don't want to be there anymore. So there is, in that sense, a question that I would like to raise today of why do people choose to be in a place, why they might choose to flee or leave that place and go to another. So that's just a short, brief opening of where I hope to see this conversation fit in the context of local government. But James C. Scott is a very provocative writer, and I chose this book primarily because you can argue with his ideas. They're very solid, so well thought out, but you can argue with them, and I think we can disagree here on some ideas. But to give us a sense of context, I am going to ask Mike Rowe, who from the very beginning was a fellow traveler in this world of James C. Scott. So I'm excited. I think he has more years than I do in terms of trying to understand what he is about. So could you give us a little background on the work of James C. Scott and then bring us back to the book that we'll talk about today?
Yeah, so Scott's original work, as you say, was kind of agrarian studies, but in Southeast Asia, and he was really interested in the politics at a local, very local level, and that's politics with a small p as much as anything. And so some of his early work focused upon the capacity to resist and to fight back, if you like. And so he wrote two books, Weapons of the Weak and Domination and the Arts of Resistance, that really focus upon those small acts, if you like, of resistance. And he then went on to look at the kind of grand state projects, modernizing projects in Seeing Like a State, which is perhaps his most famous work. And that tendency to kind of fail when you fail to kind of understand the complexity of the world in which you're intervening. And that sort of interest has developed from there, I think, to the art of not being governed. And since then, I think relevant is his work on what he calls against the grain and the role of grains, as in rice, wheat, etc., being the foundation, the bedrock of states as we understand them. But also then recently on his work on In Praise of Floods, which again relates to these questions because it's about the floodplain and they're trying to tame the river, etc. But the relationship then between the state and the river and the highlands around it is kind of all connects, in my mind at least anyway. Mm-hmm. I think also Scott is not taking aim at, but it is very much engaged in a debate which is ongoing, and that is the kind of the idea of a linear progress of the state, that we come out of the jungle, if you like, and are settled, and with agriculture then comes the emergence of a state, and that's a progress, a kind of linear progress. And your example, Nancy, is an example actually of people, if you like, going backwards. In terms of the linear progress model, it's a step backwards. It's a confusing thing to do. But what Scott's talking about in part in The Art of Not Being Governed is that stepping back from the state, rejecting it in its particular form at that time. Almost, well, in fact, literally giving up language, giving up written language because once you start writing things down, you're more easily governed, you're more easily counted and so forth. And so he sits in a kind of conversation with others. Pierre Clastres is perhaps the most famous early contributor on this, who wrote about society against the state, which is his take on how South American peoples had kind of leaders or in terms of their communities, but those leaders were pretty powerless. His argument was that was a deliberate decision, that you don't want authority, you want a figurehead that serves a different purpose. And then work by David Graeber and David Wengrow on The Dawn of Everything, which is looking at this linear idea. Is there a relationship between urbanization and the state? And they are pointing to examples that go against the linear, if you like, that there are cities without evident signs of government, and there are communities that have some form of government without any form of city or agrarian settled agricultural life, if you like. So we like a simple map of human history, and these people are saying, no, it just doesn't hold up.
Yeah. There was an example, and it's in the article that I wrote about Molokai, that there was previously from 1400 to 1800 a field system of agriculture on Molokai that fed 20 to 30,000 people. And yet when the pineapple industry and the coffee industry and the cattle industry went in, there was all this deforestation and degradation to the environment. And there's now maybe 7,000 people on the island. So this idea that somehow the early peoples were primitive and that somehow our progressive ideas of prosperity were the solution were just backwards. Scott does that again and again in his writing, just sort of flips things on their head to understand that the peoples who are actually moving away from the state have more adaptability. They're able to escape disease. They have a different way of life, a subsistence economy, which is that you have enough to live. It may not be the same as those who want to acquire wealth and make profits by the labor of others. And this sounds like a very radical idea that I am proposing, but really there's nothing against economic prosperity. It is about this process that, how you create value in a community. So if you look at that in the context of local government, how is it that we create value together at the local government level or at the other state levels, whether it's state or national level? How are we creating value? And what does that mean for the people that live in this place? So maybe there is some sharing here that if the example that I most strongly identify with is Appalachia because of my heritage in Appalachia. I began my studies in college. I was going to be an Appalachian studies person, but I've never let go of this idea of what happens to people that live in the hills and what is the difference between local knowledge. When you use local knowledge, can you go further in terms of enhancing the resources of place and the sustainability? If we're talking about sustainability, is local knowledge a better metric, a better way of understanding as opposed to experts from the outside who come in and say, we can develop this space and you can become prosperous. So with that, can I just ask Tom and Mandy to weigh in on any examples that come to your mind when these ideas of Scott, whether through your reading or thinking, what has come up for you?
Thank you for framing the conversation. Scott's ideas introduce a range of topics and considerations as we think about the role that states play in civilization and the act of civilizing, but also raises a set of important issues. I think you framed the conversation, Nancy, a little bit around why would people choose to be in a place that is governed by a state, or why would people choose to be governed in that sense? But I think that for me, the more fascinating question is really why would people choose not to be? Why would they leave, right? So for most in contemporary society, there is no choice. We are born into a state, right? But there are pathways to avoid certain aspects of being in a state. So why would people leave? In hearing you frame the conversation today, the story that came to my mind is by Ursula Le Guin, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which is a story about a fictional town of Omelas. All the people are happy. She at length describes the beautiful music, the fresh air, the laughter, the children singing, the children playing, the animals that are well behaved. There's no drugs, no crime, no alcohol. People don't need alcohol because life is beautiful and happy in every respect in this city of Omelas. Except for one situation, somewhere in the city is locked away a child who is malnourished, and she describes the child as it. It's an it. The child is kept in a dark cellar or a broom closet. Occasionally, someone will come in and throw food at it or kick it. But the rule is, in order for the happiness to exist, this child must remain in this horrible condition. If someone were to open the doors, let fresh in air, give good food, let the child hear the music, then the happiness would cease to exist. The story is called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. People decide to leave. They don't want to be part of this city that is governed in a way that condones this kind of outcome for the child, right? So it's an ethical judgment. It's a values judgment. They don't agree with the state. And so one by one, they walk off. She never tells us where, so that's left to our imagination, where they walk off to. They would walk out of the city, over the hills, into some place that presumably is not governed by people who would, or institutions that would accept the suffering of a child to ensure the happiness of the many. So why would people leave? Well, that's one example, but we can apply that to contemporary issues. What comes to mind, homeschooling, the homeschool community
Oh, interesting.
is kind of an interesting example. And I homeschool my son, and then we can talk about why I do it. But I can tell you the homeschool community is very much a fragmented community. There are some who are happy to abide by state rules and regulations and have that accountability as a check to ensure that as a parent, they are educating their child well and according to standards the state deems to be important standards for the development of a child. But you have a segment of the homeschool population that doesn't want the state to intrude at all. They want to control the entire upbringing and the socialization and the content that is delivered to the child in the form of education. Want to accept money from the state in places like Florida that offer scholarships, but they don't want the state to intrude in accountability. Or they say, we don't want the state money because there are too many strings attached. They want to have that freedom from the state, which is another kind of interesting example. Or why would they leave? Well, because their values are really tied to their identity. They want to ensure that their capacity to pass on their heritage. It's almost like what we're hearing about in Scott's book. Their ability to pass on requires in their mind that they not succumb to whatever the written protocols are for the state, to not participate in the testing process. So they want to build those values without leaving a record, without leaving a trail, without someone looking over their shoulder. That's maybe another example. So why would people want to be governed by a state is a good question, but in contemporary society, I'm really kind of interested in why people would look for ways to introduce more parts of their life that are not subject to state control.
Yeah. You raise a really interesting point there, Tom. And I want to insert in here because I think this is an important theme throughout his book because we keep using the word they because it's the way we converse. But they is very diverse, that those people who are homeschooling are very diverse. Those people who flee governments, we tend to say they are this group, this tribe. And again, he shows that there is no such thing. Certainly not in Molokai. And our host, who's also from Alaska and as a geologist, he talked about the Inuits from Alaska, from northern Canada, from Greenland, and they're just mixed and you can't even begin to peg them as one group. You could think about in the same way, Tom, in Scott's world, people leave because they're trying to escape disease. There's more disease in dense places. And yet we have our own little version of that. We have people to say, I'm going to not get vaccinated. You can argue with that. But there are people who say, I am going to separate myself from this, what we consider to be civilized, and you must do it kind of thinking. So we celebrate diversity in this community. He talked about the strength, the impact, of course, of ICE that's in his community, and that is causing people to flee. James C. Scott does a whole chapter on ethnogenesis, this idea that we have these ethnic identities. And I think people like to be in a place where there is some diversity and that feeling that they are free to be who they are without necessarily being classified. You made legible. That's his famous word, legibility. Some people don't want to be made legible. Yeah. Yeah.
I think the point that we're all circling around and the challenge that I feel on a day-to-day basis in the trenches of local government is there's not one answer. The thing that attracts somebody to a government can be the same thing that repels another person and pushes them into the proverbial hills. There's a lot of selectivity when it comes to the role that government should have. Oftentimes people want government to be involved when it's in their interest to do so, and they want government not to be involved when it's in their interest to do so. So even in Scott's books, the people that had migrated into the hills still benefited from aspects, what the state brought. They just did it in the periphery, but there was still involvement in the state's operations, primarily in trade and things like that. So I think one of the practical challenges that government has and states have been grappling with is exactly how to manage this selectivity of the public. And I don't know that there's an answer, but it seems to be something that has been grappled with since states have existed. So that's one thing that resonated to me. And I kept One of the other things I kept thinking about was, Tom, I think as you might have said, or Nancy, people are now, at least in our environments, quote, born into the state. There isn't this clear opportunity to escape to a place where the state doesn't reach. I think where we are right now, there probably are still some locations in the world, but that's not really a realistic option to just run physically from the state. So what are today's equivalents of that type of terrain resistance? And I kept trying to parallel the way people can weaponize social media and other tactics that may have evolved over time to have the same result, that build that same resistance that the upland people did in Scott's work.
Yeah.
I think just building on that, you could see the world of the dark web as an example, potentially. Unregulated world, as I understand it, I'm no expert, or fleeing to tax havens or to other ways of escaping a kind of more developed state. So every election in the UK, some billionaires will say, if the Labour government gets in, then we're going to leave, we're going to go to Monaco or to Cayman Islands or what have you. And unfortunately, they never go. It's that kind of reaction to the kind of overbearing state, I guess.
Yeah. I think about the movement for sustainability, and it's fair to say that there's not a lot of clarity around what is meant by that. But I feel that understanding James C. Scott's definition or examples of subsistence economies has brought me a lot closer to my own personal understanding of what sustainability looks like. And so I see it. For instance, there are Americans who live very, very close to the tax line so that they don't have to pay taxes. There are strategies for doing that. And within the subsistence economy, you live right at that level. It's enough for you to live on. It's enough for you to feed your family, but you're not giving profits away to a large company. You're not feeding into the government tax system. There is a version of subsistence that we have even in America. In fact, I see it growing. I see freelancers, gig economies, all kind of working off this model of I'm going to make just enough. I'm not serving somebody else. And you had heard that on Molokai. And again, this is in testimonies at the focus group studies that I read. They will spend 12 hours hunting and fishing and feeding their family. But what they don't want to do is work at a very low wage to make somebody else rich. That's against their ethics, but also to Scott's larger concern around ecological systems. When we disturb the ecological systems through big inventions of the state investment, public-private investitures that actually reshape economies. I think that when we think about the future of a place, that sense of there's the subsistence type of economy moving towards a sustainable economy, I think we're talking about very conscious, intentional dialogue about what we want. How do we create value here? Instead of what we see in mandate, some local governments who are enticed by a developer who comes in and says, I'm going to put in this development and it's going to increase your tax base and it's going to be great. And there really isn't on the part of the community necessarily a desire for that big development, or maybe you don't, I don't know, to what degree is there engagement around the types of developments that occur. We like comprehensive planning to be that process. But the degree to which we as in the local government world are in dialogue about development is a question to me. And if we say we want sustainability, which means we don't want to be dominated by one big industry or one big developer or fill in the blank. Any thoughts on that? I know that's a big.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. Some of it circles back to what I said before. Data centers are a good example of it, where one side of us wants the conveniences, the massive abilities, and all of the things that the data centers enable, but they don't want them where they can see them and they don't want them drawing on their water resources. So it's right back to that, the NIMBY environment in just a different way. We see the same things with power grids. where we want the conveniences of the sustainability potentially of the electronic vehicles and more use of the electric grid, but that also demands certain improvements on the utility structure that might impact trees along roadways and things like that. So there's always this tension between what we want and what our wants don't necessarily have consistent results as a society. And then circling back to where you were in the beginning, Nancy, with the casino example, there's one of the questions that I wrote down when we started was, what is the government's role in resistance? So
Yeah.
if when you have a group of citizens that come out, and that's is a lot of what the public forum is for, to voice opposition to something. We operate, as a local government often within this legal structure that is handed to us by the state. Sometimes legally things are permitted. What is our role in some of that resistance that might be tipping that sustainability scale? Is it really just to educate the citizens on how they can best engage in the process? Is it to take a definitive act role of resistance in some cases? So yeah, I mean, those are some of my thoughts in response to the question that you framed there.
And so
I
I would
appreciate that. Go ahead, Tom.
jump in. So I think this is a fascinating question, the role of government in resistance. I'll answer that and then back in a little bit. I would suggest the role of government when facing resistance to something is to ensure that there is an empowering democratic playing field for citizens, which is a loaded word in this conversation, for citizens to have meaningful conversation with each other and with the authorities of state to determine what the future of that community or state looks like. And so the conversation is not as much a focus on whether someone chooses to leave a state or become stateless or state proof in many ways, but it's a question of state picking, maybe picking a different city, maybe picking a different state in the United States, or sometimes picking a different country within the EU as a place to live, right? It's state picking based on preference. I'll give two examples. One on the development piece and the new casino, as I'm not dealing with that in my community, but I am dealing with an express toll highway that the state of Florida has said is going to be built in the open field right next to my house. And I had opportunity through the standard public participation procedures to express my concerns and to speak for the gopher tortoise as well as my family. But to no avail, it's moving forward. The state has even waived its own rules as to whether or not they can build such a project. And so I and my family are in a position to say, we're thinking about state picking now. It might make sense to leave this area because this state is not properly empowering us as residents to contribute in a meaningful way. We have the state, we have the developers, we have the new housing community, everything else. It's become a mess in many ways. So it's a state picking. Lithuania is a small country, about 3 million strong, but since independence from the Soviet Union over that period of time, consistently we continued to lose residents. There are spikes. So when Lithuania became part of the EU, more people left. When it joined the common currency, more people left. Why? Because there were more opportunities, financial, educational, cultural, that free movement around the European Union allowed. But what I found in my research with my colleagues was that short of providing more economic opportunity, the one thing that really would persuade someone to return or to stay within the Lithuanian state was civics, was the opportunity to participate. And I think we can't dismiss that as a possibility. And so my answer to Mandy's question is, what's the role of the state or the government? And when there is resistance, it is to ensure that the voiceless have a place to express themselves and not just symbolically. And to do that would bind each other, would bind the people together in ways beyond whatever legal requirements expect of us within civilized society.
I think that circles back to one of my favorite topics, which is public trust. And it's not always so much what the government does, but it's what agency the public has within that structure. And the public or a citizen may not agree or may not like the ultimate decision that gets made or the outcome, but if they feel that they've had agency and they feel that they've had a role in the process, they're more likely to trust. And I think that's a lot of what I'm taking from what you're saying, Tom.
I think it's also sometimes not just that they've had an opportunity to have a say, that something is going to happen anyway. It's then how does it happen? In Nottingham many years ago, when they were building a tram through the centre of the city, the consultation was about how is this going to happen? How do we keep the shops open while the tram is being built? When is the noise disruption going to be a problem? And how do we cope with that? Just those conversations. This is going to happen. It's going to be painful, but how do we make it less painful? How do you get some say in how this affects you?
Yeah.
Like Mike, to just engage a little bit around the question, because Scott came from the agrarian studies, so much of his work is on the ecological systems, which I think is a more complex question and more difficult from a local government perspective to try to get across. Although I see a lot more people questioning, do we need this many parking lots? And what are these new developments going to do to the added kinds of, whether it's erosion, but you can see it on a large scale with the agribusiness that I think in my recent writing made the point that we've gone from local farmers to sort of farmers that are contract farmers. Their small farms are contracted with larger and agricultural complexes. And I never heard Scott speak directly to that, although he talks in Zambia, which is his Southeast Asian area, just what these large sedentary agricultural practices do to the soil, to the quality of the food. It has just dramatic kinds of impact, which we don't think of. We just think of all the people that agricultural, sedentary agricultural, complex is feeding. But he raises the much larger questions of the impact of the system. I don't know what that brings to your mind, but I am certainly thinking about that a lot more, particularly in this subsist. When I see local governments, they're talking about sustainability. I'm thinking, okay, that to me is local farms. We're buying from local farms. We're not buying from giants to the extent possible. We're not ever going to be a perfect system. What does it bring to your mind, some of his work around that? And people don't want to be, I want to say, conscripted by larger industrial complexes.
So I mentioned the book In Praise of Floods. I think it connects to a lot of that. The idea that we try to control rivers and harness rivers. And actually, the rivers quite often will frustrate your efforts. But what are the consequences of harnessing the river and of building dams or channeling the current in a particular manner? What damage and just how sustainable is that? So it's kind of working with nature rather than against, I guess, is the key. Or to stop thinking of ourselves as separate from nature, more importantly, to realize that we are a part of this world. We can't simply look at it as if from on high and rearrange it for our benefit. And it reminds me of a PhD student of mine from a few years back who did some work on the problem of repeated flooding in Indonesia, and why was it government efforts to manage flood risks failed every year. And he looked at a particular river valley and kind of the role of development in palm oil plantations or luxury resorts, etc., that built in this river valley without any consideration of the kind of ecological consequences. So destroying forest above a certain level, forest that had been in the past almost treated as sacred, it led to the loss of soil and the absorption capacity of the river basin was depleted, etc. And so he was kind of looking at these old ideas. Why was it you didn't touch trees above a certain level? It's because they were effectively treated as sacred, because there was an understanding that they were important to the well-being of this place. And so those old beliefs, those old systems of knowledge, those old understandings of our relationship to our environment are ones we should be turning towards more, I think. And I think that's what Scott was beginning to turn towards in that his work In Praise of Floods as a natural thing with which we should live rather than against which we should struggle.
And of course, I'm thinking here of Tom and his work with national park systems, very symbolic in our country and around the world. Those are places that are sort of preserved as a way to understand that it's where people can mix and be with nature, a sacred place, to understand our connection to it. And so I think some of the ecological systems issues that he raises kind of mixes in with some of the climate science. And I think about people, for instance, that are moving because of fires in California. There just was, as we left Molokai, a huge Kona storm that they said they had not had for decades. It just flash flooding and massive flooding. But these are questions that people are asking, like, yes, climate change is part of the natural system. At the same time, Scott talks about how it does cause people to move. And so that is part of the natural system, and understanding the human impact that is creating or making worse when those events occur, whether it's erosion or flooding or invasive species or just the degradation of our natural resources. So I think about how we can also, as local governments, be advocates, and at the state level, of course, national level, advocates for understanding the ecological systems. Any thoughts, Tom, from your perspective?
Not necessarily from the national parks perspective, but this can go back to the reframing of the question Mandy asked earlier, which is the role of government and also the role of the citizen as an individual to anticipate and respond to, react to the changes that are occurring due to climate change. So that the simple act of changing your flight to leave earlier to avoid what could have been a disastrous moment is a private decision. You weren't being forced evacuated, but in some cases, the state is mandating evacuation from certain places. In some cases, the state is helping individuals fully relocate when areas have become impossible for full-time living. I'm thinking about the hurricanes. I don't remember now. I don't think it was last hurricane season, maybe the prior in the US. It all blends together a little bit, but the hurricane season that decimated the mountains in Kentucky and
Yeah.
Carolina and Appalachia, and really a devastating set of storms, never anticipated. But the governor of Kentucky and the policymakers in Kentucky have proactively sought to help relocate individuals from mountains that are no longer able to be supported. The risk is far too high. And so they're creating new communities for individuals to move to. They're helping to relocate. That's a role of government. Apply that to coastal living. Should government be in the place, should the state be in a place of mandating individuals to stop building in high risk environments, or is that an individual decision? So that's the role of the state and how heavy handed the state ought to be in addressing these kinds of climate issues. I'm not sure there's an answer to the question. It's a matter of preference, and that can lead individuals to go state picking again if they don't like the way their government or their state is mandating relocation or weatherproofing or creating resilient infrastructures to withstand the forces of nature. Then yeah, so it's the balance, right? And whether someone chooses to stay or leave, it will be reflected, not to keep beating on the drum, but I think it does come back to civic inclusion. It comes back to democracy. If they are brought into the process of deciding level of acceptable risk, if they're brought into the conversation to understand the costs and benefits of individual choice versus state mandate to respond not only for the current generation, but future generations to these issues, then we have stronger societies.
Yes, very well said. I think about the way James C. Scott, the language he uses, I think about it metaphorically. So he talks a lot about lowlands versus uplands or the hill people. And much of what we've talked about today I think, resonates with his ideas. He says that hill people narratives are about equality, autonomy, and mobility. And there is this sense of moving away, whether we move to the hills or the swamps, or we become a part of some group. Even I think of the Amish as they resist size and development and change of ways. But what we're doing is we are finding our own manner of which we feel a greater sense of that autonomy and ability to be a part of what, if you were to use the word freedom, Scott also says it's flight, not rebellion, that has been the basis of freedom. So there's a lot of actions. Egalitarian societies are more likely to be formed by runaways rather than revolutionaries. So, again, those people in the hills, he'll say, to your point, they move back and forth. They are very mobile. That's part of the art of living on the periphery. They're mobile, they're adept, they tend to know more languages. They may not have a written history, which is why we don't hear about them. Most of our history has been recorded. But he makes the point that I'm not going to remember, maybe Mike, you can remember, it was, for I think he said like before 1600 or something, like the percentage of people that lived outside the state was immense. And they didn't live in a state. And he says Zambia, the reason he chose Zambia is it was one of the few remaining places in the world, he says, but one of the few remaining places in the world where people largely lived outside the state. And he uses that hill, the highlands. He says these are places that government can't get to. They can't build roads. It's even in Molokai on the east end, you have the volcanic ridges that come down. You can't farm those lands, and people can there are no roads that go up into those lands. You can think about now, we have a society that because of the internet, we have a lot more access to people, but it's still a metaphor and it's reshaping in ways that we've talked about today. There's a lot of ways people are they may not live in the hills, but they're like the hill people who are mixing up techniques, whether it's subsistence economy techniques or some mixed portfolio of social structures that they're using for their own economic and political advantages to survive. So we are, in a way, it is those on the periphery that are sort of recreating a future and impacting the states, but from the periphery. Any closing thoughts? I think we've had a lot of provocative discussion today, but I am interested to know if there's any particular themes in the work of Scott that sort of resonate with you that you think you would like to sort of carry forward in your own mind and perhaps even do a future episode on.
I think for me, the other thing that Scott always makes me is our tendency to think the way we live now is somehow the way it is, inevitable.
Yeah.
But any work like this, or the work of Graeber and Wengrove, for example, throws up the possibility of doing things differently. And I think we should kind of take that away as well. But there is no one way of doing things. And we should always be asking questions about how it is we organize and relate to each other, and could we do it better?
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I would echo those ideas. That the piece of the book and Scott's ideas that we haven't really touched on, but I think is worth bringing forward for future conversation, is the framing of people who are stateless, who are not part of the state, as barbarians who are in need of civilization, right? And how states act to civilize certain populations based on some sense of necessity. Maybe it's a necessity to reduce resistance. Maybe it's a necessity or a felt necessity to extract resources from a geography or a group of people to create more safety or sense of safety or a conformity to a certain set of ideas and values, whatever the motivation might be. So bringing that into conversation. In U.S. history, we've seen that in a number of places. There's some boarding schools, right, that have no longer existing in the same form, but that took members of the indigenous population and brought them into civilized society, and basically tried to force out their indigenous ways. That's one example. But bringing it even further into today, when we think about it, what comes most to mind is the question of how we as states try to engage those who are living in poverty and who are members of minority populations and minority groups, racial or ethnic or linguistic, religious, and tried to bring them into some kind of a normal, quote unquote, normal state with the rest of the population. There's a wonderful book, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, a short little book. It's something like Teaching with Poverty in Mind. I don't remember the author, unfortunately, but I believe it's Teaching with Poverty in Mind. The author does just an exceptional job of describing how state-run schools force the use of certain types of language in the educational environment. And if a student from a population or a demographic that is not used to speaking in that very formal educational language tries to bring the language they use in the home environment or from their unique cultural space into the public school environment, it will result in academic failure. And academic failure has lifelong consequences. And so when we think about this notion of teaching with poverty in mind, I can't help but think, well, that's exactly what Scott's sort of talking about in the idea of civilizing barbarians, right?
Absolutely.
It's saying a group of people need to be educated in the ways of civilized society. And if they don't meet our standards, then they don't belong, or they need to be forced to become just like us in whatever that way that
Yeah.
is. And there are real consequences to that. That when we talk, we can think about ideas of individualism and human rights, identity formation. All of this is very much present in how we run states today. So it's not an abstract, remote part of the world conversation. It happens in our cities, communities all the time. That
Yeah.
we are forcing the culture and identities out of people to become conformist, or to conform with some accepted way of being. So, I said when my opening comment said, "Why do people leave the states?"
Mm.
But there's kind of a language here. It's not state proof becoming state proof. It's kind of those who have a state wish, who want to be part of the state, but they're excluded, right? And they're excluded because of the language that they use, right? Because of the beliefs that they bring forward. So, future conversation. I know we don't have time to unpack that
You,
fully, but I think it's worth
I, yeah,
bringing.
I'm really glad you brought this up, Tom. And it's, I think he uses the word mythology. I mean, we have this
Yeah.
mythology around what is progress and what is civilization. And I would love to dive into that deeper. But one of the gifts of James C. Scott, he's an original thinker, but he also attributes all of his ideas to somebody else. Read one of his books. Half the book will be notes and attributions of where he got these ideas. So he's always working from others who have brought just those kinds of ideas forward, the ways in which we just get confused in terms of our own identities. And it's very important to think about the roots of that language, as you say. So I appreciate that very much. And I'd love to revisit. Let's talk about that. Mandy, what are you thinking?
Yeah, and pulling on really what Mike and Tom have both offered, the thing that resonates with me, well, two things really. One is just this tension, this inevitable tension between what's good and what's bad, what's civilized, what's uncivilized, what's in the public's good, what's in the private good. And all of those terms and ideas are completely situational. They evolve. What is civilized today may be uncivilized tomorrow. And we're all in this operating in this continually changing. And the government, the state, the local government, whatever level it is in the middle of these conflicts and balancing all of these different ideas. And why somebody decides to stay in a state is going to be the same reason somebody decides to leave. And really just going back to Tom's fundamental idea of what is our role in all of that, and is really just to create the stage and the fair and the balanced framework where this dialogue can occur so that it's transparent. The complexity of all of these ideas are laid out, are exposed so that people can understand the decision making. And that's challenging, more and more challenging to do in the environment that we live in today, where news is just bombarding you and ideas are bombarding you. And it's hard, I think, to create that quiet space for that kind of dialogue.
Yeah. It just feels really great to be with some other people who share some enthusiasm for these ideas. And I just hope we can spark some others. I know just from listening to the lectures of Scott and how the enthusiasm of his audience, you hear again and again from students, I never thought of it like this. And, I think that's his gift to us. And it's really great to be here with all of you to talk about it. And let's keep the conversation going. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mike, for your contribution and being a real partner and a reader of Scott. And I hope the rest of us can catch up with you at some point and we can dig deeper. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Cheers.